It's a term that's been around since the 1960s, plausible deniability. The idea is that underlings withhold sometimes unethical information from their higher-ups to protect them from any negative consequences that may occur should the information become public. That way, the boss can deny culpability if and when things go sideways. So, is this what we're seeing in Canadian federal politics right now? Joining us now to help answer that, Nelson Wiseman, political scientist at the University of Toronto. Hello, welcome back to the agenda.
Thank you.
I want to read an excerpt first. This is from an article that appeared in the Waterloo Record on Monday. Here's what Jeffrey Stevens wrote. Let's talk today about plausible deniability, he writes. The term apparently originated in the 1960s and referred at the time to CIA black ops. It means that persons in power are to be protected from knowledge about illegal, unethical, immoral, or politically damaging activities so that they may deny, without actually lying, having sanctioned these activities because, you see, they didn't know about them. It's a form of deception, he writes. If the denials hold, they are deemed to be plausible. If they don't, the denier-in-chief will be accused of orchestrating a cover-up. That's what happened with Watergate. It was the cover-up rather than the third-rate burglary that brought down Richard Nixon. And it's where we are now with the Senate expense scandal. Okay, Mr. Wiseman, term came about really in the 1960s in sort of the context of modern days, but historically, where did this idea of plausible deniability emerge from?
It's probably as old as human nature. It goes back to the ancients, but the most famous usage of it was by Henry II. That's about 900 years ago when he was having trouble with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop, and said, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" And the next thing you know, 4 knights murdered Thomas Becket. Well, that served the purpose, and it gave Henry II plausible deniability.
And work our way from there. How did it make its way into modern day politics?
Well, it's been around, and now with so many lawyers operating, we've got all kinds of games played around the wording of things, like in the Bill Clinton case around sex. He claimed that he wasn't lying because he had a different definition of the word is. Now it's very common. We hear the term a lot more, but it's gone on, I think, uninterrupted from early times. In the case of what you call the Senate expense scandal, which is really the Prime Minister's office scandal now, because we're beyond the $90,000. In this case, in the Prime Minister's office, his underlings there, the people who work for him, his staffers, are his eyes, his ears, his nose, and most importantly, his guardians. They are the gatekeepers for who gets to see him, when they get to see him, and also what he is told in general terms, so that, as Nigel Wright said, Harper knew what was going on in general terms, but in broad terms, you don't spell out the specifics, especially if there's questions that you could be asked about it, which are uncomfortable, as you pointed out.
Okay, we're going to go through some of the language as we move on, but Prime Minister Harper is known to be a quote-unquote micromanager. Is the PM all-seeing and all-hearing?
No, he's not omniscient. He's not omnipresent because he doesn't know every single fact, but generally he knows, and staffers are required to inform him of issues that are bubbling out there, especially politically sensitive issues. And when the Senate expense scandal broke, there was a problem of controlling information and controlling the story and the way it is spun. The reason this has now all come out is because of email. And now there are ways of accessing information that didn't exist before.
We're going to talk about those emails, 80 pages of court filings last week by the RCMP. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But I want to talk about what's the role of the PMO, the Prime Minister's Office. We keep hearing about the PMO and staffers in the PMO. Let me read you this. This comes from the Parliament of Canada. Here's what it says. The functions served by the PMO itself have greatly evolved over time. In the ministries which followed Confederation, the Prime Minister's secretaries mainly fulfilled basic service roles, such as responding to routine correspondence. In more recent times, with the institutionalization of the PMO, the raison d'etre of the PMO and its staff has expanded to include a wider variety of tasks, including the provision of policy advice, information gathering, communications, planning, and strategizing. Okay, Nelson Wiseman, that's the official role of the PMO today. But is it one of the functions of the PMO to really keep Harper in this instance, but keep the Prime Minister out of the loop when it comes to sensitive situations? You said their job is to inform them, keep them in the loop, but is it also sometimes their job to keep them out of the loop?
You keep them in the loop on the broad issue. You hold back details which might make them look bad. Let me just say something about the evolution of the Prime Minister's office, which you mentioned. The big change that happened actually was under Pierre Trudeau. When Marc Lalonde was his executive, his chief staffer, his chief of staff, they expanded that office to about 35, 40 people, and they insisted it had nothing to do with getting into areas like policy, and there was barely any communication, like formal communications experts and spin doctors. And it's steadily grown since then, and every prime minister has built on that base from the late 1960s, early 70s. So now we have the Prime Minister's office has grown to just over 100 people. Moreover, it doesn't cover all of the people that the Prime Minister's office now hires through contracts. For example, when he appears now, and any cabinet appears, they have all kinds of graphics up, trying to present the most positive visual image, and videographers of every event, and a lot of that is done, which you don't see in hired staff because they've outsourced it, so they can also fob off those expenses into other line items, like in the Privy Council office. So the Prime Minister's office has become a very sophisticated operation, and now it has its fingers into virtually every policy pie. And once upon a time, in fact, when Marc Lalonde expanded it, he insisted, no, we're not going to do policy. We're just improving the capacity of the Prime Minister to get his message. We were now, in an era of air travel and more television. So that's just some background on the evolution of the PMO.
Okay, well, given that it's so big now, you said approximately 100 people on the staff, many more.
104 when I last saw the numbers.
Okay. Is it their job then, some of these staffers anyways, to keep the Prime Minister out of the loop when it comes to sensitive issues? Okay,
well, when you say loop, we've seen now in this Prime Minister's office scandal that his chief of staff said, I want to check this out with the PM. And the most damning piece in the email is, we've got the go. We're good to go from the PM. Well, what are we good to go on? And it's clear that an hour before, he'd had a letter from Mr. Duffy's lawyer spelling out all these conditions, including most critically, that Mike Duffy will be made whole, which means that legally and in accounting terms, he's not going to lose a cent. So that suggests that the Prime Minister approved some sort of scheme.
Okay. Except for in the House, we've seen Tom Mulcair use this quote, the good to go after the Prime Minister, and the fight back from the Prime Minister has been that might have known some things in broad terms, but only 2 people were directly involved in this. And leads to the question that, the Prime Minister is a busy person. Are there times, could this be plausible, times when it's beneficial for his staff to merely talk about things in broad terms and not to mention specifics about a problem to him for the sake of efficiency? We see that in workplaces all the time.
Yeah, well, they don't want to deal with specifics. The Prime Minister wants the problem to go away, just like Henry II wanted Tom Beckett to go away. And his underlings attend to that. And the Prime Minister doesn't need to know, doesn't want to know the dirty details. Although I happen to think, this is my own view, based on what we've seen from these RCMP documents, that actually he was party to some of it, including that the Conservative Fund would pay off what was assumed to be $32,000 in expenses. This has now exploded.
I want to talk about something you mentioned a few minutes ago, and that is the email trail. In this scandal and others, we look at the Ontario gas plant scandal. Public was presented with over 1,000 pages of emails between Liberal staffers. Last week, federally, 80 pages of emails between Conservative staffers and senators. Talk to me a little bit about the internet as it pertains to plausible deniability. What kind of effect has it had?
Well, it's in this case, it's undermined some of the plausibility of the Prime Minister, if I might say, because we've got incriminating pieces of information that have come out in email. It also undermines Mike Duffy's story to the Senate. It undermines the line that came out of the Prime Minister's office after it was revealed a check was cut by Nigel Wright, that was because Nigel Wright and Mike Duffy are good friends. We've now learned that actually Nigel Wright was furious with Mike Duffy and at one point insisted, let's just deal with this on a lawyer-to-lawyer basis. And and we've learned all of these things because of email. One of the things that's come out this week that's interesting is the Privacy Commissioner is now calling for government people not to use text messaging. On their BlackBerries, apparently these things disappear after 30 days. So you can't track them, whereas email you can. And what you've got to give, I don't know if we want to give the Prime Minister's office credit for this, I don't think they could have held it off, is that the RCMP went in there and the PMO said, okay, here are computers, you can go through them. And this is where they mined all this information, which is in their information to obtain order.
Emails, isn't a new invention in 2013. How are staffers, what are they doing? Because an email trail is easy, as you say, computers can be seized, authorities can find out these things. How have staffers responded to the knowledge that their conversations can now be tracked, that there's a paper trail?
Yes, their email can be tracked, but if it's very sensitive, you ask the person in an email, give me a phone call, or you meet. Or you face-to-face, or you meet face-to-face. One of the troubling things that's happened in the government is because of access to information legislation, and journalists and therefore the general public can get information about things that have happened. A lot of notes and minutes which were just routinely kept at meetings are now no longer kept. One of the rules is nobody can take notes here. So the decision that is made is not documented anywhere, so it cannot be tracked down.
So people are deliberately going into meetings saying no notes will be taken at this meeting. So there is no paper trail. There's no way to find out retroactively what was said in this meeting.
That's been going on now, I'd say, for about a quarter century, because there were some very embarrassing incidents for governments when the access to information regime got instituted. And Canada's gone from being a leader in access to information to being a laggard.
But would you say that there are increasingly more of these types of meetings where there is no notes taken by staffers at the PMO and elsewhere?
Yes, I think that's been going on for a long time, even before emails. But emails are now being used, they weren't around in a way that they weren't before. So a lot of people, there are two people within 10 feet of each other with a very small wall, and rather than talking to each other, they use email.
I want to talk about another term. This is ministerial accountability, another practice. When the Conservatives took power in 2006, this is how Accountable Government, a Guide for Ministers, described ministerial responsibility. 2006. Ministers are individually responsible to Parliament and the Prime Minister for their own actions and those of their department, including the actions of all officials under their management and direction, whether or not the ministers had prior knowledge. Okay, fast forward to 2011. The Conservatives revised the guide after they win their majority. Here's what the 2011 revisions to the definition say. Ministerial accountability to Parliament does not mean that a minister is presumed to have knowledge of every matter that occurs within his or her department or portfolio, nor that the minister is necessarily required to accept blame for every matter. Interesting change in those 5 years. How is ministerial responsibility supposed to work in the parliamentary system?
I don't attribute anything malicious to the change that occurred under the Conservatives.
Okay.
In fact, the traditional notion of ministerial responsibility has been increasingly degraded and downplayed, and that's come with the growth, the complexity, the intrusiveness of governments into so many areas of our lives, of policy, economic, social justice, and so on. Once upon a time, the idea made strict sense because ministries or departments of government were very small. The minister knew everyone who worked for them. There might only be 20 people, 30 people. Well, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people now work for the Department of Health or the Department of Transportation. Technically, you are responsible to Parliament, you continue to be, for behavior there. But if someone screws up on some flight path or fire at an airport, should you be called upon to resign? And we saw this breaking down. What is troubling is when ministers turn around and now blame their civil servants. that I find very troubling, and that undermines the bargain between civil servants and ministers. And the first time I saw this happening in a very dramatic way was after the Iraq War, or during the Iraq War. The Iraqi ambassador to the United States defected to Canada. He moved to Vancouver, and he was given immediate immunity, or refugee status, I should say. And then this came out and people complained, why was he put at the front of the queue? And Joe Clark at the time, if I recall, blamed civil servants in his department. And I thought, hey, you shouldn't be blaming them. You could make a case for why it should happen, but you shouldn't be blaming civil servants for this. And just a few months ago, it came out that some doctors with authority from Health Canada were prescribing heroin for certain heroin addicts. Rona Ambrose, the minister, started dumping on her own department, and the next day the Conservative Party issued a letter to its supporters, send us money so that we can keep our bureaucrats in check. That's beyond the pale.
Okay, I want to move on to one more thing, but just before we do that, I mean, how is it supposed to work today? If there's nothing malicious, as you say, in that 2011 revision, I mean, how is ministerial responsibility supposed to work today?
Well, you have responsibility for policy and for the execution of the successful, efficient, effective execution of the programs that your department runs. But when you get, magnitude also deals something with, I would say here. I mean, if it's a mess up of $5,000, $10,000, or one errant worker on some minor issue, it's not a big deal. But if something has been going on in your department that you've been covering up that might involve hundreds of millions of dollars, then I think you've got to take responsibility for it. The other thing I would say is it depends at what level the civil servants are at, because you are likely to have, you do have a lot of contact with your deputy minister, with your associate deputy minister, with assistant deputy ministers, and with directors. But you may not have contact with people in the field.
Sure. Okay, Senate scandal has been dominating politics, news headlines for months now, but there was something else that emerged this week that has been making the news, and that, of course, is that the Canadian government permitted the U.S. to conduct surveillance during the G8 and G20 summits in Ontario back in 2010. And it sort of plays into what we're talking about and leads me to this question. To what extent would Canadian ministers be kept aware of if Canada's intelligence activities? CSEC has said nothing about this. The Prime Minister hasn't said much. But how much would ministers have known that this may have been taking place?
I don't think they knew. And the Canadian security establishment doesn't need to tell them. And the wording I saw isn't that the government approved it. The wording I saw is that the NSA document said our Canadian partners approved it. The Canadian partners are the Canada security establishment.
So you're not convinced that Prime Minister Harper would have known about this?
Yeah, no, I don't think he did know about it, and it's also the kind of thing he doesn't want to know about, although I suspect he supports, and I think other prime ministers have understood this as well. And technically, if you followed closely the wording of the director of the branch and the minister, they simply said they hadn't broken the law. They did not deny that it occurred. I suspect. And anyways, what do we expect? That's what spies and intelligence agents are hired for. To collect information.
To spy.
To spy, and it includes getting information about your allies, because you're dealing with your allies. Look, we have such an elaborate trade relationship with the United States. Do you think they don't want to know about us, or we don't want to know about them, although they're much more efficient at this? So I think that what happened here is part of an agreement that went back a long time ago and that has occurred in the past as well. The only difference is that this now came out with the Snowden revelations, and now pressure is being put on the government. But I don't think ministers have been involved, the Prime Minister or others, on each case when we've had foreign dignitaries coming to this country.
Just before I let you go, we've been talking about ministerial accountability. Is there such a thing as ministerial accountability?
Absolutely. The Prime Minister, well, the cabinet members are individually responsible for their departments, and they're collectively responsible for the operation of the government. So, when we had the Pacific scandal in the 1870s, it wasn't just the Prime Minister that stepped down. The whole ministry, the whole government resigned. But, that's really been stretched now. And now we've got a government that's determined to buck this out by insisting that the standard of morality and ethics and what is right is equal to whatever is criminal. Well, there are a lot of things that aren't criminal that aren't the right thing to do. And the right thing to do hasn't happened here.
There's lots more going on in this story. We'll certainly be talking about it more. Thank you for coming in and explaining some of these terms. We've been hearing a lot about them, but I don't think we all understand them. Thank you for helping us understand.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.